With the help of Hashem, we are learning Beitzah Daf Lamed Aleph. We left off on Daf Lamed Aleph all the way on top of the Amid by the new Mishnah. We're going to learn more about using wood over Yom Tov, what makes wood designated to be used, therefore not muksa, and what will confer on wood the status of muksa, thus we will not be allowed to use it on Yom Tov. We're going to learn about a new concept of we may not chop wood, whether it's from a beam, whether it's from a beam that broke off on Yom Tov or prior to Yom Tov, by using a tool that we will call, let's say, a artisanal tool, a professional tool. Also continuing with the topic of uvda dechoil, we will also be learning about using or moving a pile of bricks that was designated for further construction, which for Shabbos is certainly considered muksa. And when it comes to Yom Tov, since we find in the Torah that Hashem is lenient, allowing us to do malachis for oichel nefesh, that there is a general leniency when it comes to rabbinic laws, that at times they may be overruled in order to provide for us a greater simchas Yom Tov. And we're going to have as an example, it was common in those days that they would have storage rooms underground, very much like maybe in New York, you have these doors that open up and you go down to the basement, and you have now choisomois shemakarka, certain rope fasteners that are attached to the ground, and they were twirled around the doors, making sure the doors remain closed. And we will learn that as far as untying them is concerned, since they were regularly not knotted, there wasn't a kesher shel kayama, so there's no issue with untying it. However, unraveling the rope or cutting the rope, since they are attached to the ground, that already leads us into the problem of soiser, of demolishing. And as we will learn, even when the problem is only of a rabbinic nature, when it comes to a Shabbos, we won't be allowed to unravel it or to cut it. But when it comes to Yom Tov, if we need to untie these ropes to get to whatever is stored in the place, in the room underground. So for Simchas Yom Tov, a rabbinic prohibition sometimes is overruled, and we will learn that one rabbinic is overruled and not two, and many more gavaldik halachas regarding Yom Tov. And let's start on Daf Lamed Aleph, Amud Aleph, all the way on top of the Amid by the Mishnah. Says the Mishnah, Mevian Eitzim and Hasada, one is allowed to bring in wood that is out there in the field, but only min hamechunas, only if the wood was gathered in a pile from before Yom Tov. In other words, if the wood would be scattered out there in the field, then we would classify that wood as muksa. Muksa means that no one had in mind before Yom Tov to use those pieces of wood, even though theoretically, of course, you can use wood for fuel, to cook, to bake, to warm up your house on Yom Tov, Seder, but it was out there. But the moment they were gathered in a pile, that alone is enough for us to confer on the wood the status of mukhan, and it's not muksa, and therefore you can bring it in. Umin hakarpav, says the Mishnah, that if the wood is if the wood is in an enclosed area, then even if it's mafuzan, even if it's scattered in this enclosed area, we're speaking about an enclosure like an area that's surrounded by a fence, an area that's going to be considered a secured area. Everything that's in a secured area, even if it's there the way nature put it there, no one physically handled it and piled it before Yom Tov, it's automatically not considered mukhan, not considered muktzah, and it may be gathered. And now the Mishnah says, a zeu karpav, but in order for an area to have the status of an enclosure, it's not enough for it to physically be fenced off, but kol shesamuch le'ir, it has to be near the city. Now the Mishnah here doesn't clarify what near the city means, but we learned this concept in Eiduvin. Any area outside the city, but that is still within 70 amas and 2/3 of an amma. Let's just say 70 amas and a bit is considered samuch le'ir. Mashma, it has to be samuch le'ir. It has to be an enclosed area. Then all of the twigs, all of the pieces of wood anything that can be used for fuel, even if it's scattered within there, is not considered muktzah. Yes, mukhan, yes, prepared to be used, and therefore may be gathered and used for Yom Tov. These are the words of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yossi seems to be saying something more lenient, that kol shenechnasim loy b'poisachas, that if the enclosure is an area that it's not just surrounded with a fence, but you actually need a key to get in there. Without a key, you don't have access to it, which makes all items in this karpav even more, so to say, designated to be used. Even if it's beyond the samuch le'ir, 70 amas and a bit, even if it's within 2,000 amas, it means it's much farther away from the city. As long as you don't go beyond the Tchum Shabbos, that's already considered wood. That's not muktzah. And a lot more regarding this machlokes will be clarified in the next few lines. So first of all, Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Ein Mevi'en Eitzim. He seems to be saying something that we don't find in the Mishnah. Shmuel seems to be saying a big chumrah that we may not bring in wood from out there, ella, if it has what we will call a double limal yusa, a double advantage. It has to be both michunasim. It has to be gathered. So it may not be scattered. And not only must it be gathered, but it has to be laying in a karpav in this enclosure. In our Mishnah, clearly we didn't read it that way. Our Mishnah didn't demand for both of these preconditions to have to be there. In Gemara on Shmuel, you're paskening a chumrah based on what? For in our Mishnah, we learned clearly that if it's min karpav, that if the wood is in a enclosure, then even if it's mifuzarim, even if it's scattered in there, you don't need for it to be prior to Yom Tov gathered in a pile. Answers the Gemara, you're right. Our Mishnah was not so demanding, but our Mishnah only is yichidahi. It's not authoritative. It's only following what we will call the opinion of the minority. And who is the author of our Mishnah? The Tanya. It's only Rab Shimon ben Elazar. They both agree that if there is a double negative, the wood is scattered and it's out there in the field. Everyone will agree, you may not bring it on Yom Tov because the wood has the status of muktzah. Similarly, according to Rab Shimon ben Elazar, if it's michunasim shebekarpav, if it was both gathered, that means it was handled and piled by someone before Yom Tov, and it's in a karpav, it's in an enclosure. Only here is shemevian. Here is where the wood may be used, not muktzah. Where is there an argument if you only have one or the other? Either it's taka mifuzarim, it's scattered, but at least it's in a karpaf, it's in an enclosed area, or if it's piled michunasim, but it's out there, not in an enclosed area. That Beis Shammai says lo yavi, and Beis Hillel is lenient, and our Mishnah is quoting the version of Beis Hillel, according to Rab Shimon ben Elazar, which is why our Mishnah was, so to say, lenient. Shmuel rejects the version of Rab Shimon ben Elazar, and he holds that even Beis Hillel, whom we follow, only allows for wood not to have the status of muktzah if you have both, that it was gathered, and it's in a enclosure. Amarav, further on this topic, Ale kanim, leaves of reeds, va'ale gefanim, leaves of vines. Even if they were gathered and laying on the ground before Yom Tov, and we just learned that the fact that someone gathered them is good, it already takes it away from the status of muktzah. But being that these fuel items are very light, and with a little bit of wind, they become rescattered. Even the imidli zika, if a little wind will blow, mevadar lahu, they will scatter. So the fact that they are physically gathered is insignificant. Kemifuzarim dami, they are considered already scattered, and therefore they are asurim, as we just learned, following the psak din of Shmuel, that you have to have, aside of it being in an enclosure, it has to be gathered. So yeah, wood logs, when you gather them, they remain the way they are, unless there's a very unusual big wind. But all of these other potential fuel items, gathering doesn't do anything. However, But if after gathering all of these lighter leaves, the person puts something heavier on it, which will secure it in its place, not 100% secured, but it just won't blow away with any wind, then shapir dami, then these items, like we just learned concerning logs of wood, they will not be muktzah. Okay. Then the Gemara is referring back to the Mishnah. What's a karpaf? Rabbi Yehuda says that this enclosure has to be within 70 amas to the city. Rabbi Yossi says no, it can even be within the Tchum, which is much further away. And Elyahu and the yeshiva, when they learned the Mishnah, they wondered, Heichi ka'amar, as we will see, there are two possible ways of understanding the machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi. Option number one: do we say kol shesamuch le'ir, that Rabbi Yehuda holds? Number one, it has to be near the city. Near the city again means within 70 amas. If it's beyond 70 amas, even though it's well within the 2,000 amma tchum, it's not good. Not only does it have to be near the city, for who the islay poisachas, it has to be in an area that requires a key to enter. And if you don't have these two, it's muktzah, even though it's gathered. And on that comes Rabbi Yossi to say, even the islay poisachas, if there is a key, not only is it just in an enclosure, but there is a key that's needed, then afilu b'toichat chumnami. So Rabbi Yehuda demands two preconditions. Rabbi Yossi lowers it to one. Or option number two is to understand the machlokes that each one demands one precondition, as we'll speak out. Hachi k'amar kol shi samuch le'ir. Rabbi Yehuda holds that if it's within 70 amas, that alone is enough. Whether you need to have a key to enter the enclosure, whether you don't even need to have a key, just it being close to the city, that alone is enough for it not to be muktzah. And on that comes Rabbi Yossi to say that you need to have another one precondition, and that is that if it's within the Tchum Shabbos, much farther than you, it doesn't have to be samuch le'ir, it's still going to be good. It will not be muktzah only if you have a poisachas, only if there is a key, which makes the area even more secure. But if it does not have a key, afilu samuch le'ir nami loi. In other words, according to the second understanding, both of the Tanoim require one condition. The question is, which one condition? Rabbi Yehuda demands the condition of close, and Rabbi Yossi demands the condition of locked. But they both need to have one condition. So Tashema, let's infer from our Mishnah that Rabbi Yossi is even more lenient, because since it says Rabbi Yossi Omer, Kol shenichnasim loy b'poisachas, any enclosure that is really closed, meaning you need to have a key to enter. Afilu b'toich tchum Shabbos, even if it's within the tchum, which is way farther than samuch le'ir, you still may take those woods. Shma mina, that Rabbi Yossi tarte l'kula ka'amar shma mina. In other words, if it's locked, it can be far. If it's near the town, it doesn't even have to be locked. And now that we clarified the leniency of Rabbi Yossi, Amar Rav Sola, Amar Rav Yirmiyah, Halacha ke Rabbi Yossi lo hakel Yovaldik. And all of this, as we will learn in the remaining of today's daf, don't forget, wood is needed. You're not taking the wood for nothing. You're taking the wood either because you need fuel to warm up your house, or you need to have fuel to cook and to bake. All of that is going to up. It's going to add to Simchas Yom Tov, and we will become very lenient when it comes to the value of Simchas Yom Tov, in our case, siding with the lenient Shita of Rabbi Yossi. Next Mishnah. And as the Gemara will clarify, the next Mishnah is going to be speaking about the challenge of using a tool that looks like uvda d'choil. A uman, a professional tool, generally is problematic to use even on Yom Tov. Says the Mishnah, ein mevakim eitzim, one may not chop wood, loy min hakoyros, not from beams, v'loy min hakoyros shenishbara b'Yom Tov, certainly not from a beam that broke on Yom Tov. Now, we learned yesterday that if a beam was part of a house, part of a hut, when Shabbos or Yom Tov came in, so you have this concept called Migu, the iskatsoi lebein hashmashos, since when Shabbos or Yom Tov came in, that wood was part of a building. And there was no way you can take that wood off the building because then you would be violating soiser, demolishing. So it's muksa machmas isur. The halachas don't allow you access to it. Then we learned that even if the building collapsed during Shabbos, according to Rabbi Yehuda for sure, it remains muksa the whole day. So we're going to understand, the Gemara is going to have to clarify that a koida that breaks on Yom Tov for sure may not be used, because then the wood itself is muksa. The chiddush of the Mishnah will be that even if the wood is not a muksa beam, or like we began learning in today's Mishnah, if you took it from out there, it was gathered, it was in an enclosure, it was near the city, but chopping it in itself is problematic if the tool, that's going to be the key, that you are using is a tool that is normally used by professionals. All right, it's called a maisa uman, or a keli that an artisan normally will use. And that's the next clause in the Mishnah, the ein mevakin. In other words, it sounds in the beginning of the Mishnah that you may never chop wood, but that's not clear. That's not correct. You may not chop by using a kardam, an axe. Now, the axe that the Mishnah is referring to is a tool that has a double-sided, it's sharp on both sides. One side is very wide, it's a very wide blade, and the other side is a very narrow blade. That is the axe in the times of the Mishnah. We'll see in the Gemara more details about that. Nor may you use a saw. Nor may you use a sickle. Rashi, 4 lines before the bottom of the Amid. V'kulan kelei uman. They are artisans' tools. And v'nira ka'oisa by malacha. Since a uman, a professional, he wouldn't just chop one piece of wood. He would get to work. He would do a lot of work, which is something that we may not do on Yom Tov. On Yom Tov, you can chop only what's needed for Yom Tov. So it has the appearance that you're really going to work. So that's a rabbinic prohibition. Lefikach, it's asur, but you have to chop wood. Wood that's not muksa, you need the wood. So the Mishnah concludes, Ella bekupitz, use a butcher's cleaver. Again, more details in the Gemara. A butcher's cleaver was not used to chop a lot of wood. It's meant to chop meat. When you are using it for wood, it's clear that you're only chopping a little bit of wood, the amount that's necessary right now for this meal.
Rabbi, just to clarify, we're talking about chopping wood only for nefesh, not to warm up or something, right?
No, we can chop wood also to warm up, Shlomo, because we paskin like Beis Hillel that holds that mitoich shehutra l'tzorich oichel nefesh hutra nami, even if it's not l'tzorich oichel nefesh. Okay, says the Gemara. Now again, the flow of the Mishnah, the second part of the Mishnah is telling you what tools could be used, what tools cannot be used. But the opening line and the opening clause of the Mishnah, mashma, you cannot chop wood at all. Did you not open up in the beginning of the Mishnah a mevakin, which implies a mevakin klal, that you may not chop wood at all? Now, what was that even the havamin of the Gemara? So Rashi says that Savaruha, that means that the people in the yeshiva who asked this question understood the time of the masnisin, that the problem the Mishnah has with chopping wood, aside of the tool, lav mishu muktzah, right? The problem is because chopping wood itself, that's what they thought is a malacha. Now, the achronim are debating what was even the havamin, or what malacha might it be, and some of them say that the way they would chop big logs to use, especially as cooking fuel, was chopping it into very small pieces. That's the way they control the fire. And they said that maybe the havamina was that when you take something very large and you chop it into relatively small pieces, that's already connected to toichen, to grinding, and that's an av malacha. Anyway, so they thought that the problem is that there is a malacha and there is an issue of tircha, of excessive exertion. And therefore, I'm reading inside the third line in Rashi, that they understood the Mishnah saying, even if you already had beams that were ready from before Yom Tov, and therefore they're not muksa. And they were meant to be used as fuel. Certainly not from wood that broke on Yom Tiv. In other words, the Havamina was that the Mishnah is just hinting, aside of the potential muksa, which will be the status of a wood if it broke off a house or of a hut or of a building on Yom Tiv, even if the wood is already prepared from before, you may not use this, you may not chop it, because chopping it is, number one, an av doiraisa, toichen, or some other av, and there is a rabbinic issue of it being like too much exertion. That's what's mashma. But then the seif of the Mishnah says, you can use this tool, don't use that tool. Hold on, if you can't chop it, then you should not be allowed to use any tool. So Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, in the Gemara, no, we have to, so to say, insert words that Rabbeinu HaKadosh expected for us to chop what he's saying. Number one, the opening is ein mevakin. Let's go with the Bach. Loimin hasavar shel koiros. You may not cut from a stack of beams. We're speaking about a stack of beams that was stacked on the ground, designated for it to be used for construction. That wood is called, we learned this just recently, muksa machmas chesron kis. If something was designated to be used for a usage that has a lot more value, and you want to on Yom Tov use it for something that will diminish its value, because the wood that's good for fuel can be any type of wood. For construction, you have to use a lot better quality wood. Normally, a person would never use wood designated for construction to use that for fuel. Obviously, this person on Yom Tov, he just needs a little bit, doesn't matter. So not only the Mishnah says that if the wood itself is muksa, may you not chop that wood, and also nor may you ever chop wood that broke off a building on Yom Tov. That is what we learned yesterday. Anything that's part of a hut, when the Shabbos or Yom Tov comes in, that's called muksa machmas isur. That means it's usur for you to take wood from it, because how would you take it off the building without you? That's demolishing. That for sure is muksa. Point that Shmuel is making is that that's the key. The way Rashi learns, there was never even an issue. There's never an issue of an av melachim. The worst case scenario, chopping wood, will have one violate a rabbinic. Now, muktzah is considered a very serious rabbinic decree. So, number one, the Mishnah says, if there's muktzah involved, then you b'chlal cannot chop. Why would there be muktzah? Aleph, the wood was designated for construction. Muktzah machmas chesron kis. You may never change its designation on Yom Tov, even though you need it for fuel, for food. You can't do that. You may never take wood that broke off a building on Yom Tov. Muktzah machmas isur. But if you don't have the issue of muktzah may not be overridden for Yom Tov. What happens if you have another rabbinic problem, which is of lesser weight, and that is you're doing something that looks like work? Malacha uvda dechoil avol mevakin min hakoida shenishmar be'erev Yom Tov. If wood was already cut off from before Yom Tov, it was not designated for construction. That was the first Mishnah we learned today. It was gathered. It was near the city. It's in an enclosure. That you could chop. You could use that wood. How? In other words, you can use it because there is no teichen. There is no issue with the wood itself. There's no issue with chopping wood, but the tool, that's the next clause of the Mishnah. But the tool that you are using, don't use lebekardam, don't use an axe. Don't use a sickle. Don't use a saw. Stam lohoir, that the Gemara changed the order of the Mishnah. Maybe the Amiroim had another version in the Mishnah. Ella, the Kupitz use a meat cleaver, which it's clear that you're not going to use that meat cleaver to chop a lot of wood, which is normally the way of the world. Once you're chopping the wood, you're getting it out of the way, which is something you cannot do for Yom Tov. That's just enough that you enough. You will only use that to chop the minimum that you need for that day. And indeed, Tanya Nami Hachi, ein mevakin eitzim loimen atzaver shel koiros, v'loimen hakoiros shenish b'rabbi Yom Tov. Why? Not the way they had the Havamin in the yeshiva, because there's an Av Malach involved. If there would be an Av Malach involved, then you would never be allowed to chop wood, no matter what instrument you're using. The problem would be Lefisha Einam and Amuch. Oh, it's the Reisha is saying Just make sure the wood is not muksa. If it was not prepared for Yom Tov, it's muksa. Muksa, you can't use it. If it's not muksa, now make sure you don't use a tool that is a artisan's tool. Okay. Now we'll go into details about these different type of tools. In the name of Rav, that when the Mishnah outlaws the use of an axe, and again, the axe that we are referring to is a tool that had a double-edged blade on both sides, but one side was very wide, the other side was relatively narrow. And the way Chazal used the words, that's not bad. It's not such a great picture. Okay, let me just say the words. They used to call the wider side the female side, and the narrow side the male side, just for the sake of clarity. And L'chayre was anyways, more pointy, less pointy, says the Gemara, says Rab Chinan. What side may you not use? You may not use the wide side, because when an artisan is either going to carve wood or when you're going to get to work with wood, you would use the wide side. That is what you may not do, even though you're not going to really do professional work and you're only cutting a little bit. Don't use that side of it. But the narrow edge side, an artisan, a uman, wouldn't use that side. You can use it. In other words, it's not that the whole instrument is prohibited, but make a shinoi as we keep on learning. The observer realizes you're not getting to work. You're only cutting a little bit that you need for Yom Tov. Says the Gemara, Pshita, why do we even need Rab Chinan to say it? The fact that the Mishnah allows you to use a kupitz and the meat cleaver, all right, again, it's not used by the uman. So why would you think that the axe, if you're using it not the way the uman uses it, why would you think there's a problem? What's a chiddush? Listen, if you're taking a meat cleaver, there is no wide side. Maybe only that is permitted. The kupitz, if you have an instrument that has both a kardam and a kupitz, which was the axe of the Mishnah, one side is wide, one side is narrow, then you might have thought, Ema, that migud haigisa also, since you may not use one side, maybe Chazal will say don't use the instrument at all. Haigisa nami aser. No, that's why Rab Chinan wants to be machadesh that it's a limited isur. This it looks like a professional work. It's not such a severe rabbinic, and any deviation already, Komash Mulan will allow you to use it. And now we're going to have an opposite version. Others had the version that Rab Chinoni Bar Shlemya, in the name of Rav, made a statement on the last word in the Mishnah. When the Mishnah allows for one to use a kupitz, a meat cleaver, to chop wood that's not muksa, on that, Amar Rab Chinoni Bar Shlemya, in the name of Rav, hold on. Now, obviously, according to this version, the meat cleaver had a double edge. The meat cleaver had the wide edge and the narrower edge, even though the wide edge was also used to cut the bones of the meat. It was not used to do some artisanal work in the wood. Nevertheless, since the wider part is something that an artisan might use b'di'evid to work with wood, even that, he says, make sure that even in the meat cleaver, only use the side that is never used by an artisan to work with wood. Again, by him, and according to this version, the kupitz had both sides. Aser, that's already a stringency, because even the nakvus of a meat cleaver generally was used to cut meat. Still, it's wide. It could be used by an uman. You may not use it. And here the Gemara asks Pshita. The Mishnah says, if you can't use a kardaim, which is a instrument that has a wide blade, then why would you be allowed to use the wide blade of the kupitz? No, the Gemara says we needed Rab Chinan to say it. Now the tema hanamili kardaim, which has no narrow side in that area, that's prohibited. Avol kupitz v'kardaim, but if you have a double-edged instrument, and one side is a side that you may work with, maybe you would argue, miguda haigisa shari, haigisa nami shari, the very big leniency. You would think that you can even use the wide side. The very fact that the instrument has a side that is never used by an artisan, it already removes us from this so to say, relatively weak rabbinic prohibition, don't use a tool that might look like I'm using a meat cleaver, and it has a side that's not even shaykh for you to work with wood. No, Kamash Malon, he's machmer. That any part of an instrument that sometimes is used by a professional to work with wood may not be used, even though the wood is not muktzah. Okay, so now we clarify that. Now, next din in the Mishnah. All of this is one flow, one hemshech. Says the Mishnah, Bayis Shumali Pedis. If you have a house that's filled with produce, as an example, here you have Oichel Nefesh, but the house is closed in a way, as we'll see clarity in the Gemara. I'll just speak out the clarity in the Gemara, that the bricks that formed the walls of the house was not yet cemented. Removing the bricks on a biblical level is not called demolition because it wasn't really built together. But on a rabbinic level, it's called rabbinic demolition because it was already put down together the way bricks need to be laid one on top of the other. All that you're missing is to put on cement or to put on whatever they used to put on in those days to fix the wall together. So you would argue that since the only way you can get to the produce was in there from before Yom Tov, and it's all closed, it's closed. For you to take it out, you have to undo the wall. Undoing the wall is prohibited on a rabbinic level. Does that make the produce muktzah? If the only way, like we learned yesterday, if you have a wood that's part of a hut and it's built into the hut, it's woven into the hut, there, of course, the wood is muktzah because the only way you can get it is by demolishing it on a biblical level. Iser d'oraisa. So there's no way you were going to do it. So it's completely set aside for your usage. Here, midoraisa, you can take the wall apart, but midrabanan you may not. So the question is, does it render those fruits? Now you can say, Lamay nafkamina, you can't get to it anyway. No. What happens if during Yom Tov, somehow one part of the wall got breached? You didn't ask for an anju, he took out some bricks. I don't know, there was a hurricane, something knocked into the wall. It's now you have access to the produce without breaking even a rabbinic law. Question is, does the fact that when Yom Tov came in, the only way to get to it was through violating only a midrabanan, does it make the produce in there usher for the whole Yom Tov or not? That's the question. Beautiful. So again, bayis shumali peidos. You have a house that's filled with produce. And now v'nifchas, now the wall became breached on Yom Tov. Says the Mishnah, noitel mimokoim hapchas, you are allowed to use the breach to get to the produce. And we don't say, well, 1 second, before the wall was breached, even though it's only midrabanan asur to take apart this wall, but it's midrabanan asur. So a person was not going to violate a rabbinic. So maybe all the produce was set out from one's mind. A person never even dreamt of using it. You can't get to it. No, says the Mishnah. If you don't have to violate a biblical violation for Yom Tov, then now after the fact, you can go take the produce. And Avmeir says more. In our case, this is a very big statement. Since it's Yom Tov, as we'll learn, Shitas Rav Meir, since we find that Hashem was lenient regarding food preparation, that you can mamish, you can cook, you can shecht. So there's a certain leniency. You're trying to get to produce, something that you're going to eat on Yom Tov. Says Rav Meir, you are allowed to break rabbinic demolition in order for you to get the food. Wow. And that's a big statement. In other words, as we will learn, that sometimes Simchas Yom Tov is going to trump over a rabbinic. Now we learned above, the last sugya was umuk. What about the wood? Muktzah is also a rabbinic. Not so simple. But let's say that sometimes, according to Rav Meir, a dirabanan, a prohibition, midrabanan will be set aside in order for the person to be able to better celebrate Yom Tov. Says the Gemara, the whole Mishnah, when we already spoke at the end, that we're speaking about a wall that you only have to demolish on a rabbinic level. Because if this is a wall that's properly built, and taking away the bricks would mean that you are violating a av malacha d'oraisa, that you will not be allowed to do. That you will not be allowed to do. Food. So let's go with Shitas Rashi. We learned this in the beginning of the Masechta. Rashi holds that any malacha that had you done it before Yom Tov, the end result will be just as good if you do it on Yom Tov, right? You can't harvest wheat out of the field on Yom Tov. Food, oichel nefesh, you should have harvested it before. You should have ground it up before. Lisha, kneading, and further that you can do on Yom Tov, because if you would have kneaded and baked the dough prior to Yom Tov, it would not be as fresh. It's very important. But anything that could have been done before, there's no heter of oichel nefesh. Demolishing a house to get access to the produce could have been done before. So, the whole Mishnah doesn't make sense. And that should render all of the produce muktzah. And how can Avmeir say you can do it? So Amar Rav Nuchumi bar Ado, Amar Shmuel, that Mishnah is speaking about a case. Ba'avira de livnei. You have bricks, you have livnei, but there's air in between them. Doesn't mean there's air in between. It means they were not cemented together. Therefore, removing that wall is only a rabbinic problem. That's the Nakud of the whole Mishnah. Trekking about it, no. Amar Rav Nachman, Hani livnei di iyatur mibinyana. If bricks were left over from construction, then we say that they're lavdafka, they're going to be used in another construction site, and therefore shari lital tulinu bishapsa, they may be moved on Shabbos, because the owner of a few leftover bricks already knows that he might also use it as a chair, something to sit upon, which is something that you may do on Yom Tov, and therefore it's not muktzah. Hoyel v'chazi lemizga alayu. The mizga means to sit and sit on it. But sharginu. But the moment the owner piled up these leftover bricks, again, what did we learn today? When you pile something, normally you designate it for construction. In other words, if the owner did something that demonstrates that he's planning to reuse these bricks in another construction site, so then vadai aktsinu, they are muksa. So the problem is, okay, I get it that the Mishnah is not speaking about a wall that was properly cemented together, but the person built a wall. What do you think he wants? He wants that wall to remain there. He needs to smear the cement on it. It was mamish designated for construction. So you got a muktzah issue here. It's not only soiser. Muktzah is a very serious rabbinic. So indeed,
Rabbi, you don't put the cement on afterwards. It's done layer by layer. So
that's the way you do it. And first of all, it could be, and then they're going to take it off and put cement and put it back on. Could be they would smear over some other type of, I don't know how they used to build them. Point is that if someone has already a wall, even prior to being cemented together, clearly you see the owner wants this to be a wall. It's designated to become a house. Got a muktzah problem. So Amar Rav Zeda, indeed, that our Mishnah's heter is only b'yantiv. That's the whole chiddush. However, you quoted a Rav Nachman, there avaloi b'Shabbos. Wow. And let's read inside the Rashi. 12 lines from the bottom, like 4 or 5 lines before the end of the narrow lines. Amar Rav Zeda b'yamtiv, hitir Rav Meir. Yeah, you're right. There's even a muksa issue and a soiser issue. Shekiven them in the Rabbanon the Aser umishum simchas yamtiv shari. Why? Like we mentioned, because since we find in the Torah sharei muter by oichel nefesh, so the Chachamim set aside rabbinics for simchas yamtiv, getting food. Avoloi l'Shabbos mishum tiltul kirav Nachman. So we have a bigger chiddush. That really Rav Meir isn't only saying that we set aside a soiser midrabanan, even a muksa. Now we know there are many levels of muksa, but this level of muksa for Simchas Yom Tov is set aside. And indeed, Tanya Nami Hachi, Rav Meir oimer af poiches lechatchila v'noitel, you can breach the wall, and this Beitzah says explicitly that's only on Yom Tov and not on Shabbos. Why? Because nowhere do we find that the Torah is lenient, and even though the issue is only a midrabanan, so what? You cannot violate the drabanan to get the food on Shabbos. And now that we spoke about demolition, we're going to speak about another common challenge that they had in the way they lived. Again, they would have certain storage rooms under the ground. They would have doors that would be closed off with ropes or tied closed with ropes to make sure that it's harder for the door to open, or animals should not be able to open it. These were not ropes that were tied with knots that we learned in Masechta Shabbos. untying a kesher shel kayoma is a biblical problem, but they were fastened close. So Amar Shmuel, these types of knots and ropes that are attached to the ground, because the doors were attached to the ground. One side of the rope is attached to the ground. The other side of the rope was wound around the door. Then the din is matir. We may untie it. And Rashi makes it very clear, 2 lines under the Gemara. Obviously, if it was not tied with a halachically double knot, okay, it was made to be tied, to be untied. We can tie a tie, we can tie shoelaces, that you can do. The chiddush is, you may neither unravel the rope, undo the rope, nor may you cut the rope. Why? Because what's the problem? Rashi writes, don't forget, if you're cutting it, you're doing a mice of kilkul. So you can argue you're ruining. Ruining is not a problem. It is, because you are demolishing. In other words, the door being affixed or being closed with a rope, you taking away the rope is an issue of soiser. However, Shabbat, if a utensil is wound closed with a rope, then not only are you allowed to be matir, can you unwind it, but even mafkia v'chaytech, you can unravel it, you can cut it. Echad Shabbos ve'echad Yom Tiv. Why is that? Because when it comes to kelim, remember, ein binya ve'ein stira bekelim. Hold on. Frek the Gemara on Shmuel. And he concluded, and there's no difference between Shabbos and Yom Tiv. That will be the challenge. Frek the Gemara Meisvei on Shmuel says in a Beitzah about the same. It was a common thing. All of these ropes that tied closed a door, all affixed to the ground. B'Shabbos matir. Only on Shabbos matir. On Shabbos you can only untie it, because then you're not violating anything. But on Shabbos you cannot be mafkia. On Shabbos you cannot be choyteich, because even though you can argue you are ruining the rope, no, but you are demolishing the closure. Now you have access. But on Yom Tiv you can be more lenient. You can be matir umafkia vechoyteich. Now that's clearly not like Shmuel. Shmuel cannot go against the Tanach. Shmuel writes, both on Shabbos and on Yom Tiv, you may never be mafkia and choytech. So here the Gemara says, now we have the answer. That Hamani, the Beitzah is a lot more lenient than Shmuel. Now we got it. Because Soiser, at least midrabanan, according to Rav Meir, can be set aside because of Simchas Yom Tiv. We're speaking about a choisamois shebakarka that has underneath it food. Answers the Beitzah, that's more lenient. We'll follow Rabbi Meir. The Amar af poiches lechatchila v'noiti. And the Chachamim in the Mishnah argue, no, even stira midrabanan is also even on Yom Tiv, and therefore ba'ana, meaning Shmuel says, and I will pass it like the Rabbanan. Hold on, frek the Gemara concerning the choisamois shebakarka. Don't compare the case of our Mishnah with the case of this type of seal in the ground, or a tied rope closing a door in the ground. We learned in a Beitzah Vaited clearly. You are allowed to untie it. But on Yom Tiv, the Chachamim are also lenient. The Yom Tiv matir umafkia v'chaytech. Again, this concept that if you have a rabbinic, there's one rabbinic issue here, which is soiser midrabanan. Even the Chachamim are moeded that on Yom Tiv you put aside soiser in order for now. Before we go on, hold on. If the Beitzah is writing clearly that the Chachamim allow for you to violate soiser, so I have a simple question. So why do they argue in the Mishnah? In the Mishnah, the Chachamim don't allow you to take apart this wall. Very important, that's the Nakuda. Because there are two issues in the Mishnah. When you have a wall made out of bricks, even though it wasn't cemented together, Aleph, taking the wall apart is rabbinic demolition. Number two, like we learned from Rav Nachman, the fact that the owner put these bricks as a wall means he wants them to be a proper wall. I know he still has to cement it, but it's a muktzah issue. So the Chachamim will hold, not Rav Meir, that if you have to break two rabbinics, Simchas Yom Tov won't trump over 2. It will trump over 1. And when it comes to the Chaysama Shebekarka Luchura, the only issue is one issue of Saisa. So again, who is Shmuel following? Daf Lamed Beis on the top. Answers the Gemara, and I'll answer you. That Huda Amar, Shmuel is Machmed, but he found another Tana. Huda Amar Ki Hai Tanya. The Tanya Chaysama Shebekarka, you are always allowed to unwrap, to unwind it, because that's not even called tied to begin with. Mat. That's not an issue. No, it's this Tana holds that even if there's only one rabbinic problem, so what? It's also midrabanan. You can't justify it because of Simchas Yom Tov. However, b'shebekeli, b'Shabbos matir. We're gonna review this, God willing, in the next year. But on Shabbos, you are always allowed to untie it. Even on Shabbos, on a keli, still you may not unravel the rope, you may not cut the rope. And b'yamtiv matir umafkia b'chaytech. So we're going to address the seifa of the Beitzah next year. But what's the takeaway? Very important. The way we're learning is that, so we learned today about muksa, and the big chiddush is that Rav Meir holds that even muksa, compounded with a rabbinic stira, is put aside for Simchas Yom Tov. And we learned that the Chachamim agree that one rabbinic prohibition, if it's not muksa, can be set aside. But as it's either because it's a double rabbinic, many people understand because muksa is considered the more serious isur midrabanan. That is something l'rabanan is not set aside. But l'kula alma, if the wall was breached, since getting to the wall is not an isur doiraisa, it does not make the produce in it, so to say, given this katsoy muksa machmas isur. We don't say that. The wood and the hut yesterday, we do say isur daraisa, we do say, and we don't say that by an isur darabanan. We'll stop over here, God willing, to be continued.
Good Yom Tov.
Good Yom Tov, Chavra. So God willing, the next year will be Thursday morning at 5 a.m.
Thursday at 5.
Thursday at 5.